The wind that swept across the Bavarian hills carried the faint metallic tang of jet fuel, a smell that most people ignored after a while. Elena Kruger never did. She stood at the edge of the supply depot with a clipboard in hand, her plain gray jacket zipped halfway against the chill, a faded pair of jeans brushing against boots scuffed from years of wear. A battered thermos of coffee balanced easily in her grip. To anyone passing, she looked like part of the background the kind of civilian contractor bases were full of. Someone who counted crates, signed papers, and stayed out of the way when the real work began. The yard was busy that morning, recruits loading gear into transports, officers calling out schedules, the crackle of radios punctuating the air. Elena kept her head down, her pen moving steadily across the manifest. But her eyes, those didn't stay still. They flicked to the horizon every time an engine roared, tracked shadows that passed over the tarmac, lingered a fraction longer on the vapor trails cutting across the high sky. Her ears twitched toward every sonic ripple, every gear shift in the air. Nobody else noticed the difference between a clean throttle push and one masking a tiny stall. She did. A group of recruits wheeled a cart past her, their laughter too loud, too sharp. Young faces full of swagger, chins tilted like they owned the air itself. One of them, a tall boy with hair cropped close, slowed his pace to look at her. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying over the hum of turbines. "You lose your way, file clerk? Logistics are 2 hangars down." His friend snickered. Elena wrote a number on her clipboard, her expression unreadable. Another recruit, broader in the shoulders, chimed in, grinning wide. "Bet she's never even seen a cockpit. Probably thinks a throttle's something you put on a tractor." The laughter spread, bouncing between them. It was easy to laugh at someone who didn't push back, at a woman whose jacket looked like it came from a thrift store bin. Elena capped her pen, slid it into the spine of her clipboard, and finally looked up. Her eyes settled on the loudest one, calm and unwavering. She didn't scowl, didn't smirk, didn't give them anything to feed on, just silence. She adjusted her thermos lid, tucked the clipboard under her arm, and turned back toward the crates. The recruit's laughter stumbled, then tried to recover, but something about the way her gaze had lingered left a small, uneasy gap. Inside the depot, the air smelled of oil and cold steel. Elena ran her fingers lightly over the serial numbers stamped into the side of a crate, matching each one to her list. Her hands were steady, precise, moving with the same controlled economy that once held a control stick through 8 Gs of turn. Nobody here knew that. Nobody here would guess that beneath the quiet, beneath the faded clothes and scuffed boots, lay the memory of skies burned white with contrails, of combat drills that had carved her instincts into stone. A jet roared overhead, its engines rattling the corrugated roof. Elena stilled, her pen hovering above paper. Her head tilted just slightly, listening. 2 degrees off balance on the second engine. Most would never hear it. She did, and she knew exactly how much altitude the pilot had bled in the last turn. A flicker passed across her face, gone as quickly as it came. She bent back over the crate, finishing her count. In the distance, the recruit's laughter rose again, carrying into the warehouse. She let it roll past her, unacknowledged. Silence was her answer, but the weight of it pressed harder than any words could. For Elena Kruger was not what they thought she was, and though they didn't know it yet, one day they would wish they had kept their jokes behind their teeth. The hangar smelled of ozone and steel, the sharp bite of electronics mixing with the faint grease of engines. Rows of screens glowed against the dim light, their green radar sweeps tracing arcs across digital skies. The recruits sat rigid in their chairs, helmets at their sides, eyes fixed on the tactical simulation unfolding before them. The sound of roaring engines piped through the speakers made the walls hum. It wasn't real, but for them, it was close enough. Elena Kruger stood at the back of the room, clipboard pressed against her chest, coffee thermos balanced loosely in her hand. She hadn't been invited, logistics staff never were. But she had a delivery slip for replacement headsets and had lingered longer than necessary. Nobody stopped her, nobody noticed her. That was how it usually went. On the monitors, the F-22 formations banked hard over a jagged digital mountain range, the recruits calling out maneuvers with clipped voices. Elena's eyes tracked their vectors automatically, her mind sketching lines through the air where their blind spots hung open like wounds. She shifted her weight slightly, her breath slow, her fingers tapping once against the metal thermos. A dive was too shallow. A coverage pattern left the flank exposed. They didn't see it, but she did. She always did. Captain Meyer, the instructor running the drill, paced the aisle between the simulators, arms folded behind his back. His face was all stone and scar tissue, but his voice carried a faint amusement when he caught sight of Elena lingering in the shadows. "You there," he said, jerking his chin toward her. "Logistics lady, what do you think? Are boys flying like eagles or pigeons?" A ripple of laughter rolled through the room. Heads turned. Elena didn't shift. She let the silence hang just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then she nodded toward the central monitor, her voice calm, steady. "Your squadron's exposed on the left flank. Enemy drones are threading through the blind angle in your radar net. In 12 seconds, you'll lose half the wing." The laughter died, clipped mid-breath. Captain Meyer frowned, gestured to the operator. On the screen, red blips emerged, slicing through the very gap Elena had named. The simulated missiles struck clean, 5 jets down in a flash. The room went still. Chairs creaked as recruits shifted uncomfortably. Elena sipped her coffee, unfazed, eyes on the screen. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply lowered her thermos lid with a click and returned her gaze to the radar sweep as if nothing had happened. From the front row, a voice broke the silence. Lucas Brandt leaned back in his chair, his flight suit unzipped just enough to flash the edge of a patch that said Valkyrie Squadron. He was tall, broad-shouldered, jaw-sharp as though carved for recruitment posters. The golden boy of the base. His grin carried more arrogance than humor. "Cute trick," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Anyone can play video games from the cheap seats. Out there, in the real sky, weather in your teeth, G-forces in your chest. That's where people like you fold." His laugh echoed through the hangar, cocky and cruel. A few recruits chuckled nervously, trying to stay on his side. Elena turned her head slightly, her hazel eyes resting on him for a moment. No flash of anger, no defensive retort. Just silence, the same kind that made her presence heavier instead of smaller. She adjusted the lid of her thermos again, the faint metallic click filling the space his laugh left behind. Then she turned back to the screen. Lucas's smirk faltered, but he forced another chuckle, waving her off like she was beneath notice. The others tried to laugh with him, but it didn't land the same way. Their eyes kept drifting back to Elena, to the woman who'd seen what none of them had, and said it like it was nothing. The simulation reset on the monitors. Engines roared through the speakers. Elena made a note on her clipboard, but her gaze lingered on the sky mapped across the screens. It was only a simulation. But her body remembered the real thing. The pull of gravity, the vibration of metal at the edge of its limits, the moment when silence and speed became the same thing. She swallowed a mouthful of coffee and stayed where she was, waiting, while the recruits flew on, none of them realizing that the quiet woman in the back of the room had once owned skies they could only imagine. The desert sun of Nevada burned white in her memory, the endless sky stretching so far it felt like another ocean. Elena Kruger had been 21 then, her hair tucked into a regulation bun, her eyes hidden behind mirrored aviators. At the Top Gun school she was not Elena, she was Wraith. The nickname clung to her because she spoke only when necessary, and when she did, her words cut with the precision of a scalpel. She was the pilot who didn't need chatter, who let her flying speak. In the classroom, her notes were sparse but flawless. In the cockpit, she was untouchable. Dogfight drills ended before they began when she was in the air. She moved like vapor, appearing where no one expected, vanishing before the enemy could react. Her kill ratios broke records so cleanly the instructors stopped marking them on the board. Some said she was born for it. Others whispered it was something darker, that she saw the sky differently, as if every line of thrust and lift existed in her head before it happened. But just as quickly as she'd risen, she was gone. One day her bunk was stripped bare, her call sign scratched from the whiteboard in the briefing room. No announcement, no explanation. The whispers filled the gap. She just vanished, they said. Some thought she'd washed out. Others said she'd been pulled into something classified. The truth followed her like a shadow no one could touch, and Wraith faded into silence. Now, 12 years later, the Bavarian sky tore itself open with a storm. Sheets of rain hammered the airfield, lightning turning the world into strobe flashes of steel and smoke. A squadron scrambled to prep their jets, technicians shouting over the thunder. Elena stood by a stack of gear crates, clipboard tucked under her arm, rain dripping off her jacket. She was supposed to be counting, logging, invisible. Instead, her eyes tracked the F-22’s through the storm, each roar of afterburners tugging at something inside her that she had buried deep. A bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating her face for a moment longer than the storm should have allowed. The longing was there, sharp and unmasked, the look of someone who had not only been in that seat, but had once ruled it. She caught herself, lowered her gaze, and reached for a crate strap. Her fingers tightened with unnecessary force, as if anchoring herself to the ground. Inside the command trailer, radar screens flickered with interference from the storm. Operators struggled to track the jets weaving through the squall. A senior colonel, gray hair damp from the rain he'd just run through, leaned over a console. He caught sight of a woman standing at the auxiliary station, one hand on the radar dial, steady as stone. The sweep shifted under her touch, cutting through the interference, the blip snapping into crisp formation. The colonel froze. His aide glanced at him, confused by his sudden stillness. The colonel's voice came low, almost reverent. "That's Wraith's scan. Nobody else moves like that." The aide blinked, his eyes darting to the woman with the clipboard and scuffed boots. "Sir, that's logistics staff." But the colonel wasn't listening. His jaw tightened, his hands behind his back. For the first time in years, he felt a ripple of unease that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The ghost of Top Gun had just revealed itself in silence, and he knew the sky would not stay quiet for long. The storm pressed against the base like a living thing, sheets of rain slashing sideways across the runway, thunder rolling so deep it rattled windows in their frames. In the control tower, voices scrambled across overlapping channels, strained and sharp. A pilot on routine patrol had sent out a garbled SOS, fragments of words cracking through static. Hydraulics, failing, can't eject, losing altitude. The transmission ended with a squeal of interference. The room fell into a suffocating hush. Every eye turned to the radar. A lone blip flickered erratically, dipping lower with each sweep. The storm made tracking near impossible, but the pattern was clear. Whoever was up there was in a coffin of steel and fire, seconds away from falling out of the sky. Colonel Hartman stood rigid, his jaw locked tight, his eyes searching the room of young pilots. None of them moved. Lucas Brandt leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his broad chest, his smirk faltering but still in place. "Flying blind into that?" he scoffed. "Suicide. Let the rescue crews dig him out when it's over." No one spoke, no one volunteered. The storm outside was more than weather, it was a wall of death, a gauntlet that no sane pilot would touch. In the back of the room, Elena Kruger stood near the doorway, her clipboard dripping from the rain she'd carried in, her thermos forgotten at her side. The radios crackled again, a strained half-cry from the pilot above. Something in her eyes shifted, a flicker that broke through the mask she'd worn for 12 years. Lucas noticed her stare, and his grin returned, sharp as a blade. "Still just watching, logistics girl?" His voice rang over the silence, cutting the tension into something ugly. "Thought so. You'll count crates while real soldiers do the bleeding." His laugh echoed, but it was thin this time, strained. The colonel didn't look at Lucas. His gaze was locked on Elena. He'd seen the hand on the radar console earlier, the way she steadied the chaos with a touch. He remembered the call sign whispered years ago. Wraith. Elena's jaw tightened. She set down the clipboard, the slap of paper against metal startlingly loud. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the locker room, her boots striking the tile in measured rhythm. Conversations stuttered, radios hissed, the storm roared, but her silence cut through all of it. Inside the locker room, she shrugged off her soaked jacket, tossing it aside. Beneath it clung a faded flight suit, worn from years but still intact, a patch stitched into the sleeve. The black letters had dulled but were unmistakable. Wraith. Gasps echoed behind her. A group of recruits had followed, eyes wide, mouths open. One whispered, "No, it can't be." Another muttered, "She vanished." Everyone said she was gone. Elena ignored them. She zipped the suit to her collarbone, tied her hair into a low knot, and pulled a helmet from the rack. Her hands didn't tremble. She walked the corridor to the hangar, past stunned cadets and silent officers, her steps steady, unhurried. The storm howled as the hangar doors groaned open. An F-22 sat waiting, its skin gleaming wet under the lightning flashes. Technicians tried to protest, voices rising, but the colonel barked a single word, clear. The floor emptied. Elena climbed the ladder, strapped herself into the seat, her fingers moving across the console with a fluency that made the jet seem like an extension of her own body. Systems flickered to life under her touch, the storm shaking the steel around her. For 12 years her voice had been absent from comms, a ghost name whispered in mess halls and forgotten files. Now it returned, low and steady, carrying through the static with unshakable calm. Wraith, wheels up. Engines roared, the jet surged forward, and the storm swallowed her whole. The entire base stood frozen, eyes lifted to the sky, holding their breath as the ghost of Top Gun rose again.